so we can begin our career panel, that'd be great. As a reminder to anyone who has given a talk or will be giving a talk. Hello, everybody. Hi. Thanks. Important reminder for anyone who has given or will still be giving a talk at the Symposium, whether yesterday or today, please remember to fill out your media release forms. If you are okay with us posting the video of your talk onto our website, you can fill that out and drop that in the same box where outside on the table where the post-conference surveys will go. If you're not okay with us posting your talk, that is perfectly fine, but we will not post your talk if we don't have a media release form. Also a reminder to fill out your post-conference surveys at some point today and drop them in the survey box outside on the table. Alright, so we're about to begin our career discussion panel. So I want to take a moment to introduce each of our speakers. You may notice Dave Spiegel was unable to make it at the last minute, but thankfully one of our own participants, Daniel Angerhausen, who you heard earlier, has graciously volunteered to step in and give us his perspective. Daniel received his PhD from the German Sophia Institute and then Caltech. He then moved on to a postdoc at RPI and is now an NPP fellow at Goddard. He's in the process of starting up a company that he will tell you more about. We also have Eric Jensen, who is a professor of astronomy at Swarthmore College. He holds a BA in physics from Carleton College and a PhD in astronomy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And over on the end, we have Josh Shiode, who completed his PhD research at UC Berkeley. He is currently the Senior Government Relations Officer at the AAAS, and he was also the John N. Bahcall Public Policy Fellow at the AAAS. So, I'm going to ask our panelists for some brief introductory remarks. We gave them a prompt to help them with this, so if each of you could go in order, please comment, tell us a little bit more about your career path, where you came from, and how you got to where you are now. And also, many people in the audience are probably considering between academic and non-academic career paths after they receive their PhD or after they complete their current postdoc. Thank you very much. So can you talk about what your thought process was as you went through the same considerations that a lot of our participants have right now? What did you feel was the most helpful to you in crystallizing your decision to pursue the career path that you chose? And what do you wish that you had known before you got on your current path? So whatever order you choose.
Sure.
For it.
I can go first. So to give you a little bit longer version of that bio, so I did my undergrad at Boston University. I went to Berkeley for grad school. I didn't take any time off in between. And I did some sort of explorations during graduate school. I realized probably like 2 years in, maybe 2.5, 3 years in, that maybe research wasn't the path I wanted to take. I've been convinced of it up until then. And I kind of thought what I liked to do was to talk to people and to really think about the big problems that we're working on, but the coding and the sitting behind a computer every day was not making me so happy. So I did some work with some education groups. So I worked with a group called Compass at Berkeley that did some summer programming, some mentoring, and other things for students from underrepresented backgrounds in physics. And I not only taught for them, but I got involved in the program administration and had a good time doing that. I also did some science writing with a local on-campus publication that it was sort of targeted at graduate students, but not in your department. So imagine writing for somebody who's in, bio PhD. And then, so I did those two things, and I also got involved in some volunteering outside in the community. And what kind of crystallized for me there was that what I like to do, like I said, was talk to people, was interact with folks, and have more of that collaborative atmosphere be a part of my everyday life, as opposed to the thing that I really like to do but was not happening very much. And so when I looked for jobs, what I decided to look for was things that sort of met those criteria. And so what I applied for was jobs in science education, science communication, and science policy. And what I tell people is that I didn't know how to apply for real jobs, and I still kind of don't. And so what I got were 2 fellowships and no actual jobs. And the 2 fellowships happened to be in science policy, and so that's the direction I headed. It was not a, I did not make a priori decision to go that direction, but I really, really enjoy it. So I started, right after grad school, I moved to DC to work as the Bahcall Fellow for the American Astronomical Society. So there you're working to sort of bridge the gap between policymakers and astronomers. You're also working to, so that involves educating the astronomy community about policymaking, as well as myself, obviously, since I was a fellow, so it's very much a training position. And then also educating policymakers about the things that astronomers care about. So when it comes to science policy, there's sort of 2 things. There's science for policy, that's sort of like the science of climate change and how that should impact policymaking. And then there's policy for science, which is the thing that I think most of you are thinking more about, which is how the hell am I going to get a grant next year? So those are the so we work more on the policy for science stuff when I was at AAAS, and I still do that now with the AAAS. So I think there are a lot of these jobs that sort of sit at the interface between scientists and some other sector of society, whether it's policymakers, students in terms of teaching in high schools or teaching in at universities and teaching at museums, and then science and the general public. And there's a lot of science communication work that you can get into there. And I think that PhD students who are good communicators and who really enjoy that, who derive a lot of satisfaction from it, can do really well in these positions because you've been trained how to think critically, you've been trained how to communicate effectively, and those are important skills that are sometimes lacking in these sort of interface kind of jobs. So the most what thing was the most helpful to me in terms of making my decision? Like I said, I didn't really make a conscious decision to go into science policy. I just kind of threw myself into it, applied my sort of training to figuring out how policy works and trying to get a better sense of that. And yeah, it's not a really helpful answer. I'll think about it and you can come back to me. What do I wish I had known? I wish I had known how to apply for a real job. I talk often to people about how I think graduate education should change, and I think one of the big things that should change is career development. Should be a much bigger part of our education as graduate students. And I think that's happening in some fields, and the National Institutes of Health has this program called BEST that's trying to change that for those fields. But we need to see more of that in graduate education, I think, and that'll really help people, not just practically in getting jobs after grad school if they're not going to go into academia, but also mentally and psychologically. I think that's a huge part of it. I see a lot of people, I certainly had the experience of being really depressed and uncertain about where I was headed as a grad student. And I think if I had had the experience of getting training in how to get other jobs and what other jobs are even available, what I could possibly do, that could have done a lot for me as a graduate student. So, yeah.
All right, thanks. So first, I'll just say that being on a panel that's labeled as alternative careers feels a little bit funny to me when I'm an academic, right? I'm a college professor. That said, what I'll say is that the job that I have and the job that I do every day may look a little bit different, or maybe a little bit different than what many of you may have been exposed to in terms of the academic astronomers that you deal with. I mean, most of you have either recently completed a PhD or you're working on a PhD, and so like the college professors that you often see are people at, research, or people by definition, at people at institutions that have PhD programs, right? So I'm going to sort of weave together a little bit of my own story, but a little bit of I think maybe what I can contribute is a little bit of perspective on what the breadth of higher education and the breadth of academia looks like in the United States, because there are a lot of different kinds of institutions where the balance between different parts of your job look pretty different. So as was mentioned, my undergraduate degree comes from a school called Carleton College, and I'm currently at Swarthmore College. Both of those are what are called small liberal arts colleges. Many of you may know what that is. It's not a very common phenomenon outside of the United States, so I'll just say just a few words about that. So my current institution has 16 undergraduates, sorry, not 16, still a small number, 1,600, a few orders of magnitude, 1,600 undergraduate students and no graduate students. That's it. It's a fully undergraduate institution. So all the teaching I do and all the research with students that I do is with undergraduate students or undergraduate degrees. Going to an institution like that as an undergraduate is really, I would say, what set me on the path to the job I have today. It's a little bit cliche to say, perhaps it's like, well, I had this as an undergraduate and I thought that would be great to do, and I'm very fortunate to have been able to do that. Right after I got my undergraduate degree, I actually thought, I don't know what I'm doing, I can't go to grad school now because it's like I couldn't even at that point envision. So one of the features of some of these small colleges is a pretty broad education. So I was a physics major, but a lot of other things. I thought, well, I can't spend my whole life just studying one thing. That wouldn't be very interesting. So I taught high school for a couple of years. That taught me a couple things. One was that I did like teaching, but also that showed me that I missed sort of digging into something more deeply. So I went to grad school and really enjoyed the process of wrestling with a problem more deeply, with making, as a lot of us had, some discoveries, even though they're very small ones. You know, that feeling that, you know, you just figured out something that nobody else knows right now is cool, and something that I'm glad to still be able to do. My current job right now has, I guess what I would say about the sort of breadth of higher education jobs in the US is that there's a range of institutions, and a lot of what faculty members do is teaching. Of course, that's maybe one of the obvious things that we think of. Research is another thing, but what the balance between research and teaching is in a given academic job really spans a pretty broad continuum. At a Research 1 university, the primary, I would say, and people can disagree with me, and they certainly have a better perspective on it than I do, but I would say the primary job of a faculty member at a Research 1 university is to have a strong research program, to be able to support grad students, to be able to support postdocs, to be able to bring in grant money to fund that enterprise. I don't mean to imply that those people don't care about teaching. Many of them are excellent teachers, but in terms of sort of institutional structure, that's not necessarily viewed as the primary part of their job. At the other end of the continuum, by far the majority of students in higher education in the United States are at community colleges, 2-year institutions. Those people's job is completely teaching, completely focused on teaching. Places like Swarthmore sit in the middle, where teaching is very much a valued part of the job, but also there are expectations that you'll continue to be a scholar, that you'll continue to be a researcher, at a different level, I would say, than somebody at a Research 1. So I still do research, I still publish papers. I don't do nearly as much of that as somebody at a Research 1 university does. So those two things are more sort of balanced a little bit in the middle. I enjoy being able to do both of those things. What I wish I had known, I guess, or what one of the challenges is both of those enterprises, research and teaching, are complicated, they're challenging. They're not things that necessarily have a recipe attached to them. And what that means is that both of those will take as much time from you as you're willing to give them. So the challenge with having both of those be part of your job is now you've got two things that are potentially all-consuming, and you have to find the way to keep those in balance. You know, like I said, I love being able to do it. I like my job, but I do wrestle with figuring out how can I feel like I'm doing a good enough job teaching my classes, and how can I feel like I'm still staying active as a researcher and still knowing what's going on and still trying to figure things out. So it's an ongoing challenge, but I'm glad to have that challenge.
Yeah, I'm Daniel. So I got my diploma in Germany from the University of Cologne, and then continued my PhD work with the same supervisor who got a call to become the director of the German Sophia Institute at that time. And while he was moving, he kind of parked me at Caltech for a year. So that meant I did like 1 year in Cologne, 1 year in Pasadena, and then the third and fourth year in Stuttgart, Germany, where the German Sophia Institute was. So already for my PhD, I was at 3 places in 4 years. Then I got my first postdoc in Hamburg right after my PhD, more or less through connections of my supervisor with the director there, so not really through an official application process. Then, more or less unexpectedly, my money ran out in December, so I was actually unemployed for 6 months in Germany. basically working on my science paid by the unemployment agency, but technically unemployed. So, and I was really close from leaving science at that point. So, that's actually one of the lessons learned. You have to make sure to run through the October, November AAAS job register flood of applications, because once you are unemployed in December, you might stay unemployed for half a year because there's nothing, really no positions in that half year, or not many positions in that half year. And then right before I had my own deadline or my own personal inflection point to leave science, I got an offer from RPI, from John Morse, who started there at the New York Center for Astrobiology. Did 2 awesome years there, and then today I'm an MVP fellow. So in 2 years from unemployed to MVP fellow, so everything can happen. Yeah, one of the things, as you might have heard, I never really had a choice. So I always had like one offer or no offer to accept. So there was not really a big choice, and I guess unless you're like a really hot shot, there are usually not many options for you too. So one of the other lessons is maybe to not be too focused on something, not say, okay, I want to be a grad student there, then I want to have a postdoc there, and then I want to be a faculty member there, because that's not going to happen. So really keep your eyes open for opportunities that you maybe didn't consider from the first place, I think. Then obviously networking is a big thing, so if you do great science but just sit in your closet and don't get your message out, nobody knows you. So I guess at least 25% is getting your name out, getting in contact with people, have people, you know, realize that they need you. Yeah, so that's probably for the jobs inside of science. And yeah, just briefly, so I really just started to think about starting a company, or we just started to build a business plan, and probably going to launch our company end of the year, beginning of next year, which is also similar. So I don't want to give up too much, because you know I don't want anyone to be my business. It's also roughly in the field of science communication. So, and I think even if you're not completely leaving science, I think that's still a great field to get, you know, some extra income, like a YouTube channel, a blog, and stuff like that, which many of you I know do already. So this might, even if it's not feeding you completely, it might at least feed a little bit more than a usual postdoc strategy. So, yeah.
I just want to return to the question that I totally flubbed. So, in terms of what was the most helpful thing for me to crystallize my decision to go sort of, at least to not go the academic route. So I mentioned that I did a couple of sort of exploratory things during my 3rd, 4th, 5th year. I think what I got out of that, not just the experience of those things, but I ended up getting several mentors outside of my department who worked in completely different areas. So one of them was in the biology department. He ran this thing called the Biology Scholars Program. And then another one was in the dean's office. She was she's like the vice dean or something for diversity and inclusion in the physical sciences. And so those people really helped me broaden my horizons and think about where I could go next, and had no stake in whether I stayed in academia or not. You may not think about it all the time, but your advisors do have some stake. I mean, their reputation somewhat depends on where you end up in some cases, and I think more and more faculty are more open-minded about where you end up, but there are still those who think you need to continue my academic lineage. So it's good to have outside voices, I think. Informational interviews are huge. These are just send somebody a 3-line email who has an interesting job that you like, and say, can I talk to you for half an hour, either by phone or in person. In fact, I see Jason at the back of the room, and I actually called Jason's wife, because Jason's wife was a Merzion Fellow for the National Academies of Sciences, and Jason and I shared an office very briefly while we were at Berkeley. And so I called her up, and she talked to me for half an hour about what her experience was like doing that. And she connected me with another person who did the fellowship. And I did it a number of other times, and I think it's incredibly useful if you're thinking about exploring other careers. And then info sessions. I just kept an eye out for anything that looked interesting in communication, policy. I went to a couple for the science and technology policy fellowships that exist. And those were really important to me in really just making me realize how many other options there were that I could potentially enjoy.
All right, well, I guess I will start off with a question of my own. So my question is, what are some skills that you learned early in your career, perhaps undergrad or graduate, that have really served you well over the years in the rest of the different jobs that you have had, whether they're academic or non-academic? Anyone?
I guess one thing that I would say is writing and speaking. I mean, so you may not think of your proposal writing, but maybe you do, but I hope you do. Think of your proposal writing in the same way that you think of, papers you might have written as an undergraduate or something like that. But there's, it all comes back to communicating clearly what you want to do. That's a skill that's going to serve you well in almost any job that you can pick. I think is being able to convey a message concisely and clearly, to think about who the audience is for what you're trying to do. I can't say that I've thought of this consciously yet when I was younger than I am now, but I certainly think about it now.
I completely agree. I think that's the most important skill that I took away and that I use now. I think just simple, softer skills that you don't recognize that you're gaining. Things like being able to meet deadlines, things like being able to lead and participate as a follower in collaborations. If you've ever written a first out of the paper, you've led a collaboration, you've led a team, you've led a project. You just kind of need to, when it comes to sort of expanding your horizons beyond academia, you kind of just have to say the same thing with different words, and other people understand what skills you have. And I think that's a huge part of the gap in terms of getting jobs outside of academia is you say, well, I was the first author on a paper. And somebody who's in HR at the AAAS goes, I have no idea what that means. And if you say, instead, I led a project and put together the final report for that project with a team of 6 people, some of whom were my superiors, some of whom were my subordinates, some of whom were just my peers, they get that. And you didn't lie, you didn't say anything untruthful, you just said it in a different way. And then just critical thinking skills is the thing that, as PhDs, you bring that's unique often to these sort of positions. They're not, people who don't have a PhD or didn't work towards one for some amount of time don't necessarily have those same sort of harder skills that, I don't know, that you read or hear about on the news, how poor we are at teaching our students in high school.
Yeah, I second or third that communication thing. Definitely communication is the key skill. And maybe also going to more interdisciplinary meetings. That's what I think helped me a lot, to meet people who are kind of doing the same thing but in a different field. That helps a lot to just broaden your horizon and see what they are doing. And maybe just don't worry. If you think about, worst case, even if you don't get that dream postdoc, worst case, you end up being a data scientist in a company and make 3 times the money. So, if you imagine that's your worst case scenario, you should really stop worrying and waste energy on that. Stop to worry and communicate.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes?
Question for Eric. When we talk about teaching at liberal art colleges, so say if I want to aim for such a job right after PhD, what types of ranks do you have? Is it similar to like assistant professor, associate professor, and full professor? And what type of teaching load do you have? Thank you.
Good question. So the question for people who hear was at a liberal arts college, what kinds of ranks are there? Assistant, associate, full professor, and what's the teaching load? So I'll answer for my own institution, but I'll try to give a little bit of what perspective I have on how that works elsewhere. So I think most academic institutions in the US have those standard 3 ranks. So assistant professor it's not, as an older professor once said to me, the people who assist the professors, the full professors in his case. The assistant professor means you don't yet have tenure, you get reviewed for tenure. First step is associate professor and then full professor. So that's a standard that applies, I think, to most, certainly to 4-year institutions, both undergraduate and graduate, but I think to some extent probably community colleges as well. Teaching load, so that's something that's a big variable across different kinds of institutions. So for me personally at Swarthmore, it's 2 courses a semester. So, and there's some variant depending on how you count labs, and the sciences is always a little bit of a variable across different institutions. At a community college, it might be, instead of 4 courses a year, it might be 4 courses a semester, or in some cases, maybe even 5, I think. At a R1, I don't know, somebody here can maybe answer it, but I think it's not uncommon to have 1 a semester, but there can be some variation too, and I think it may vary more there on how much research you're doing. There's more of a sort of an institutional option to have that vary based on your research productivity, however that's measured, or your funding that you're bringing in and so on, whereas that's not so interesting. Right, so the balance, so how much time you're spending, and I think there's really a correlation, or an inverse correlation, between what your teaching load is and what your expectations are for research productivity.
Yes?
Sort of continuing along that, how important is prior teaching experience for applying for a job like that?
So for us, so when I'm reading job applications, what I'm really looking for is somebody to, first and foremost, to demonstrate that they know what they're getting into. In other words, that they've done a little bit of research, they've talked to some people, that they know what kind of institution they're applying to. And it's, you know, it's not reasonable to say you know exactly what that job's like, but at the same time, if you don't show any indication that you have, you know, put any effort into finding out what the institution's like, that's a bad sign. The job application letter I got once that said, I would like to apply for your research position, and then, this is a true story, and then in pencil, research was crossed out and teaching was written in. That application didn't, I was happy because it really made my job easier. Put that one on the bottom of the file and it makes a good story, but that's not what you're shooting for. So what I would say for us is the primary thing that, so an ideal application, there's no ideal application. Teaching experience is, so knowing what you're getting into is first and foremost. Teaching experience is certainly valuable, and especially if you can show, if you can narrate what your role was in the intellectual input into that. So teaching your own class is more valuable than being a TA in another class. Not to say that the latter isn't valuable as well, but being able to show that you've led your own class. That said, for my institution where there is a balance between teaching and research, we really are looking for people to have a solid research program as well. And I'm aware when I'm reading job applications that having some good research momentum is very valuable in going into that, because the amount of time that you have to do it full-time as a postdoc is a lot more than the amount of time you're going to have when you're starting a new faculty position. And so a nice combination is, you know, I don't mean to say that you have to do everything, but we are sort of sitting in that middle place. So a solid research program and some teaching experience. I would say there actually is a little bit of diminishing return to multiple years of teaching experience coming into a faculty position. If you've shown that you're able to do that in, you know, for a year, it's probably not that different, you know, than you've done it for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years.
So I had 2 questions that came from what you were saying. So one was, what fraction of the applicants, like just ballpark, back the envelope, are clearly just rehashed R1 applications that didn't put a lot of thought into it? And then the other question I had was, so when I was looking at, I thought about this a little bit because I really liked teaching when I was a grad student, and almost across the board, I went to this thing where there were a bunch of people who were, I think in the vice chancellor's offices or something for small liberal arts colleges. They said almost everybody that they hire now has, even for small liberal arts colleges, has to do a postdoc, at least 1, if not 2, before they can even get a job. And that has changed significantly since in the recent past. And I was just curious if that's true for your school.
Yeah, so as to the latter question, that's generally true. That having a you know, the strongest applications are people that have done a postdoc and have also had some teaching experience. The postdoc really shows to me that you can start to establish that research program on your own, and that you'll be able to, in the face of other demands on your time, be able to keep that up. And we have the luxury of getting a lot of applications that look like that now, right? How many applications look like they're just sort of straight out of an R1? I don't know, not half, you know, a quarter maybe, something like that. I mean, and like a lot of things, it's a range, right? It's a continuum. of how really focused in on describing well how they fit into that job versus shading more towards other things.
Another question for Eric here. I was wondering sort of to what extent are these schools looking for someone that can really be doing research versus are looking for someone that is more willing to be focused on the teaching? In other words, are you having to find a place that is willing to give you a bunch of time to work to be doing research as well? Or with like the liberal arts schools, are they expecting that to be a given part of it?
So I'm not sure I totally understood your question. So how much is there an expectation that you're doing research? Or
Yeah, are sort of across the board, are they looking for someone that will necessarily be doing research with the liberal arts schools, or is there sort of a range there?
right, so I think there is some range, and I think, but I think, I mean, so there's unfortunate in my view, there's a lot of schools that used to be very focused on teaching, kind of chasing this model of being, if not an R1 institution, of having research be an important part of your mission. So I think in four-year institutions, you would not find a lot that won't at least talk about research as part of your job. I think what resources you're given, I mean, so and I think you have to look at the teaching load and look at the resources to get a sense of, to try to calibrate a little bit what those expectations might really be and whether they're realistic or not. But I think, I mean, so our model, I would say, are now meeting, so Swarthmore in this liberal arts college world sits at the very well endowed, and we're very fortunate to have a lot of resources to work with, and that's reflected a little bit in teaching load. Even for us though, so my expectation, so the expectations for somebody in my position about getting tenure is really a question of, are you showing evidence of scholarly engagement? Are you showing evidence that you're part of this scientific conversation that we're all part of, and much less about quantifying that. So it's not, you're publishing X papers a year, and it's actually definitely not bringing in grant money. So if I was fortunate to get some research grants before I got tenure, but I'm pretty sure that even if I hadn't done that, I would have gotten tenure anyway. I know that for sure. But it's not really part of the revenue model of the undergraduate institutions in the same way that it is with the R1s. And you don't have grad students, you don't have postdocs to support. Undergraduate researchers don't cost that much to pay in the summer, so it's less of a, so it's more feasible for the institution to fund those with its own resources. I hope you get some questions.
Yep.
Yeah, so it seems like in going from grad school to getting a postdoc, there's a couple different ways, maybe two separate paths to take. We learned yesterday about the lower probability path of, writing an amazing proposal and getting a Sagan or a Hubble Fellow. That's like a 17 to 1. That was the statistic that was put up yesterday. But Daniel, you mentioned that you perhaps landed a postdoc through word of mouth, through your advisor and the director. So if you're not possibly going to find yourself in that 17 to 1 on the one side of that, then what's the best way of going about getting a postdoc in the other way?
Communication again. I mean, just be in contact with the people, with the team that you work, or people who are on the same team, or people that you cite, work that you like. Just contact them and just try to do it early enough. Don't make the mistake to start writing applications after your defense, because then it's too late. So you should maybe start a year in advance. So it's usually easier to postpone the starting date than to wait to get a position. So yeah, stay in contact with people, go to meetings, talk to people, I, for example, showed like a possible postdoc position on my slide, so that's where you pick up these people. If you sit in your lab doing great work, you won't find that position. And yeah, it's putting your name out and, talking to other people. Go to a poster that sounds like you, look at the names on the poster, write to these people, so yeah, that's how it works. And often it's like, it's not even that all of the jobs are on the AAAS register. Sometimes people just have money lying around that has to be spent, and just didn't think about, I could use this postdoc right now. So it's really word of mouth often.
Daniel first.
So I had a question for you, Eric. You said that it's good for applicants at the small colleges to have a postdoc or 2 postdocs on their resume. But for most of us, we started grad school as TAs, and we did 4 years of not teaching, and then a couple postdocs. That's another 4 years, right? So the teaching is sort of, it's an older part of your resume. So you've had some time without teaching. Is that not a weakness, or does that not count against you?
So you're saying you might have done a couple postdocs, but the main teaching experience you had was as a grad student, for example.
Yeah,
right.
Just back in time.
Yeah, so I think so the kind of thing that I'm thinking of, so first I didn't say you got to do 2 postdocs, so you could. I think the first one is probably more important. Teaching experience, kinds of teaching experience that I sometimes or often will see is not necessarily a separate teaching position, but somebody who took an opportunity for 1 semester to step up and be the lead instructor for a particular course. Maybe while they're in grad school, maybe while they're a postdoc, maybe in a summer sometime. So even something like that goes a long way. So I see it not uncommonly sort of concurrent with a postdoc, or sometimes even people having taught their own class within grad school. I think there's a big variation in sort of how departments think about that and how departments function in terms of, are they willing to let a grad student do that, or the views of your postdoctoral supervisor as to whether that's something that is valued or tolerated or discouraged. I was discouraged a few years ago to talk to somebody who was a postdoc at the Institute for Advanced Study and who was teaching a community college class at night and keeping it totally a secret from anybody they knew because of how it would be viewed that they were spending time doing this. So that's an extreme, but and I'm not bringing it as a model, but just to say that there's different views. I mean, it could be something so this implies a little bit that you're having some choice, but as you want to think about when you're taking any job, is this a job I really want, and what's it going to be like to have this job? And so conversations that you're having with a potential supervisor, for example, or with people who have worked with that, can get a little bit of a feel if you think that's a direction you might want to go in, how the person you're going to be working with views that, and how sort of possibly taking a little bit of your time to explore some other things or build some other skills can contribute.
So my second question is for Josh. How is your AAAS fellowship different from your AAAS, and what is your work like right now?
Sure. So the question was, how is my AAAS fellowship different from my AAAS fellowship, and what is the work that I'm doing now? What is that like? So I'm actually not in a fellowship now with AAAS. It's a full-time position, so could be for a long time. But what Karn is referring to probably is there's a whole suite of fellowships that you can get going from PhD in science to science policy. So I did the AAAS Bahcall Fellow. That's 1 person solicited every 2 years. It's now closed. The AAAS runs a very large program for policy fellowships, about 200 fellows, 250-ish fellows that go to the executive branch, so they work for the departments of Energy, Department of Defense, NASA, NSF. Most of them actually, the highest fraction end up at the National Institutes of Health and the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. And there, what you're functioning as is you're sort of the science person around, but you're doing some sort of job like program management. USAID folks, a lot of them are doing program management where they're managing an international development program overseas. And then 30 fellows a year go to Congress and work as a staffer for a member of Congress. There's that fellowship. There's also a similar fellowship program in California, the California Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. That's in Sacramento, the California legislature. And then there's the Merzion Fellowship that I brought up, which is a shorter term position. It's about 10 or 12 weeks, and you work at the National Academies of Science working on science policy issues there. So what my job now is, I'm the Senior Government Relations Officer, or a Senior Government Relations Officer in the Office of Government Relations at the AAAS. So government relations jobs are sort of, in the science world, are sort of bridging the gap between scientists and policymakers. And so part of my job is talking to scientists about the policy issues that will affect them. Part of my job is talking to policymakers about the science issues that they should be paying attention to. I had a really fun meeting actually the other day with some of my colleagues. The AAAS is running a forensic science study right now. So there was a National Academies report in 2009 that basically said all this forensic science is lacking actual science. So things like rifling on bullets, all the stuff you see on CSI. They basically looked at it and said, there's not really any good science underlying this. So that kicked off a whole series of events. The Office of Science and Technology Policy interviewed forensic science practitioners and asked them for information like what supports what you do. And so the AAAS is running a program where they're actually looking at the articles that forensic science practitioners say they use, so the lab techs, all these guys, and trying to see if they're actually good peer-reviewed science that's replicable and meets the standards of science as we know them. And so we went up to talk to the committee staff on the Hill who work on this issue. And just brief them about the study that we're doing. And so we had a really interesting meeting where we just kind of talked about all the things that are associated with what we're doing and how that relates to the legislation that those folks want to write. So that's sort of an example of the kind of thing that I do. Also, analyzing legislation, meeting just one-on-one with staff for different members of Congress about various issues like funding for the agencies that we care about or policies that, for instance, would forbid the Environmental Protection Agency from using the results of Department of Energy research to implement regulations. So as you can imagine, that's a stupid thing. Yeah, so that kind of describes what I do now. I would say my job with AAAS, I did a little more interfacing directly with the science community than I do now with the AAAS. Otherwise, it's a similar position.
This is for Josh. I know you said you tried to veer away from research, but I'm wondering if you came across any positions where it was like science communication and research instead of a position where you're research and teaching and then science communication would be like side work for you.
Sure.
There like hybrid?
Yeah.
Positions?
So the question was whether there are positions, and tell me if I'm getting this right, positions where sort of science communication or policy or whatever is the main thrust, but that you still do some research.
Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, the AAAS Bahcall Fellowship, part of the contract that you sign says you get 20% of your time back to do research if you want. So some of my predecessors in that job have used that time to do research. In practice, the job can take 130% of your time. So it's kind of up to you. I knew I didn't want to go in continue with research, so I didn't do any. But that's possible. So in terms of, I've come across some positions on the job register actually. You might know about some of these, like at Goddard and Space Telescope Science Institute, where the primary thrust, in fact I know somebody from UT Austin that just got that job, I forget his name. But he works at the Space Telescope Science Institute. He's in the office of outreach or something like that, but he has research, I think it's 50% research. So there are positions like that, and in terms of postdocs, the NSF postdoc, that's a significant part of what you do your primary thrust there is the research side. But the other thing to keep in mind is for the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, which is 1 or 2 years and it's a full year, and we have 275 people coming to DC every year. It's been running for over 4 years now. Some fraction, I think it's around 40%, go back to research. So some of those people are faculty taking a sabbatical year to do it, but some of them are people who got a postdoc and deferred. Some of them are just people who want to test the waters and then they go back. So I know that people get counseled, like if you're pre-tenure, don't even think about spending any time doing anything else. I say, tell them to shove it.
Yeah, so I can also talk about most of the NASA missions actually do have an EPO part. Actually, if you write a proposal for a mission, you always have to already include a part for EPO. So there are positions, for example, at Sophia, we have 4 or 5 people working on education, public outreach, going to AAAS meetings, having meetings there, going into schools to teach infrared astronomy. We even have like a so-called airborne ambassador project, where like high school teachers can win a flight on Sophia. So and these positions are also like 50% service for the project and 50% doing your own science. Then there are actually funding opportunities on ROSES or Inspires, which are dedicated for education and public outreach. So you can actually apply with an outreach program, just as you submit like an ALAB proposal or an XRP proposal, you can actually submit a proposal for whatever kind of public outreach or education, STEM education project you have. So these are definitely opportunities where you can combine, keep on doing science and do public outreach.
So, is it harder to make scientists politically savvy or to teach science to politicians?
So the question was, is it harder to make scientists politically savvy or teach science to politicians? So I would take issue with your latter point. Teaching scientists, policymakers about science is the wrong way to approach it. So I think is a big issue with how we communicate science often, is that we communicate at people and not with people. And that definitely applies for policymakers. Especially since if you walk into a Congress member's office and you're meeting with staff, the power dynamic, well, you, if you're, say, a tenured professor and you like to lean back in your chair and wax philosophic, you may think you have the power in that situation, but guess what? The guy on the other side of the table writes the law. So the power dynamic's in the other direction. So I would say it's actually harder to make scientists understand how to communicate with policymakers. And I would say it's because of what I just said. That we can have this somewhat arrogant attitude, and physicists are particularly guilty of this. Policymakers, on the other hand, rely on people who come in to talk to them for expertise on various issues. I mean, you can get really upset about how much lobbying there is, but when you get there and you see what it is, I mean, some of it, yes, it's the horrible stuff you read about, the huge amounts of money flowing and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of it is people like me, people in completely other sectors, healthcare, anything you can think of, who are spending all of their time as experts on some subject, talking to somebody who's a staffer for a member of Congress who has to spend all their time on 50 different things. And they just can't be an expert on this, but we need to write the best laws we can write. So they're primed to get good information. They're ready for it. They just need to be communicated with in a way that they can access and connect to. And so I think the challenge for me I found at the AAAS primarily, especially, was helping scientists understand how to communicate in a way that will be received well.
Just about your feedback, just for a sec. I think, depending on how you think about teaching, it may be teaching, because in my view, the best teaching is, I just read a really striking statement in an article in Physics Education Research that very early in the article said it's impossible to teach anyone anything about physics. But what they went on to say is that I think the best teaching is motivating people to want to learn something about that. You can get people to want to learn, and then you can give them the tools they need to be able to learn that. And so I think that's what Josh is saying, is that you're trying to make something salient to somebody, and then you're giving them what they need in a way that it's accessible to them. And I think that's a great way to think about teaching too.
Yeah.
This is to Josh again. What kind of job opportunities are there outside of societies and federal government? I'm thinking like maybe state governments or NGOs or something.
You mean particularly for policy?
Yeah, for science policy.
So the question was, what other jobs are available other than like working for societies, universities, and government in terms of science policy jobs? So there's a lot of lobbying that goes on, right? So there's a lot of government relations work available. You can work for associations and societies in the sciences. You can work for universities, almost all universities. In fact, I know the guy who works for Penn State, have a federal relations or government relations department. You can work for companies. You can be in-house government relations or policy for companies. You can work at think tanks. It kind of depends on what you want to do. So my job is more the talking to people side of it, and less of the rigorous analysis side of it. But there is that side of it too. So there are like policy departments at various universities. MIT just started a new policy group, but they have several already. There's places like Brookings and that kind of place that does science policy sort of white papers and think tank kind of stuff. So it depends on where your skills lie and where your interests lie, but there's a lot available, and especially if you're working for an association or a university where they need people who can interface with the PhD scientist, but also with the policymaker, your PhD is highly valued, right? Because let's be honest, the PhD is sort of a club card for a lot of folks in the science community, and I know from personal experience that when I'm sitting in an audience in a suit, people don't think I have a PhD, and then when I say I do, the mood changes, and it's really quite striking. I encourage everybody to try sitting with a bunch of scientists in a suit. It's fun.
Jason?
So one of the reasons that we talk about alternative career paths being outside of the tenure line track is because of when we're learning astronomy and physics, that's what's around us, is people that took that track, when in fact it's not a majority.
Right.
Most people don't do that. So in some sense that is the alternative path. So how can students getting their PhDs and their advisors find these connections, who to call for the informational interview, and make those connections? How do we find these people in maybe positions that we didn't even know existed but are dying to find some good astronomers to hire? Maybe this is a more general question than just a panel. What resources exist?
So, not many, but every campus has a great resource if you can get them to help you, and that's the Alumni Association. Every campus, I know because everyone I've been to is sending me emails and phone calls, is wanting money from me, which means they know where I am, and I often don't tell them where I go. And I move a lot, so they find me. The problem is they like to keep those lists close because they want the money. And they're worried that you as a department are going to convince them to give the money directly to the department or directly to some program or blah, blah, blah. I've run into this with the Compass project that I work for. We had a really hard time working with the fundraising office. But I think if the faculty can get together and make this a priority to say, we need to talk to the alumni offices and we need to make sure that we have access to all of our alumni, or just do a better job. I mean, it seems stupid for each department to have to do their own job of getting that list together, because it exists. But I think if the faculty made it a priority, you could get it, and then you know where everybody is. They know where everybody is, and you can figure out who to get in touch with. Because alumni connections are usually the best. In terms of, for individual students, I think the way to go about it is, anytime you do an informational interview, find one person. You're going to find one person because there's going to be somebody in the class above you or the class above that you can talk to. Ask them to connect you at the end of the interview to 2 other people. That's the advice that I've gotten. So at the end of your conversation, don't let that be the end of everything. You want them to give you something to do next if they don't mind. And I usually, when I'm talking to somebody about career stuff, will automatically come up with 2 or 3 other people who's probably good for that person to talk to based on their interest, because I know lots of people who are in these quote-unquote alternative paths. So it's usually not a big ask for most people.
I have another comment which might also be a segue to the imposter syndrome thing. So I think a key point is to identify and be aware of your actual skills. So you might think, I'm just an expert in RV of M-dwarfs. There's no RV M-dwarf industry, so where can I work? I mean, that's kind of how we used to think, but if you look at the posters, you are a great data visualizer. If you can work with a messy Kepler data set, you can definitely work with a cleaned up insurance company data set. If you really get aware of these marketable skills that I search for on the job market, then you already have the keywords to just throw them into job search engines. And the funny thing is, actually, it's kind of ironic from what I hear from people who leave science, that there seems to be a huge difference between the self-perception. So we always think, yeah, we're not really ready for the job market. But on the other hand, the people who potentially hire us think we are overqualified. So there's a huge gap between our self-perception and how we are perceived on the job market. So I think if you start to be aware of that and aware of your skills, it might be much easier to actually go that step.
Just one quick thing to add to Jason, and I'm sure you've thought about this already. So for us as faculty, I think it behooves us to keep, So I think the alumni office is a resource, especially if you want to go back a little over time. But it's in our great interest and in our students and former students' interest to keep track of them, to keep in touch with people as they go, and especially those people who maybe don't finish their degree, who maybe do other things. Those are the hardest ones to keep track of, and it takes some effort. But over time, it pays great dividends. And I don't mean actually even ever asking them for money, but just knowing who they are, knowing who they are, and knowing where they are, and then over time, you can both describe to your students what the range of trajectories has been, and you can also hook people up with people who have interesting things to say.
All right, I'm going to steal the microphone for the final question since we're low on time, which I'm also hoping will tie into Jason's talk on imposter syndrome. So each of you at one point or another has been at one of these large R1 universities, Berkeley, Madison, Caltech. So I'm wondering, do you feel that your mentors would be disappointed that you're no longer at one of these R1 universities? Do you feel like you've let someone down by not continuing that legacy? Or do you think that people look at you and think, oh, well, maybe they just couldn't hack it at an R1 university? Thoughts?
This is a yes or no question. So my advisor is very supportive before I ended up. Actually, my whole thesis committee, but I sort of selected them that way. There are definitely people at Berkeley who probably think I couldn't hack it and are disappointed that I'm not at an R1 institution or in academia at all. I don't care, is the honest truth. But I don't plan to go back. So if I had a different career path, I might care more. But I would say the overwhelming majority of the faculty in our department were happy to see me find something that I was excited about and interested in and have found success in. And my advisor looks at me as a success story in a different vein.
I would say something very similar, which now I'm again doing something that's less different than that than other people, but nonetheless not at an R1 institution. My own advisor was super supportive, and I'm really grateful for that. I do think there were probably other faculty in the department, at least at that time, who may not have felt the same way, but by and large, people were pretty supportive. And I also am happy with what I'm doing. That's okay, so they can think what they think.
Yeah, I don't think either. I think the supervisors are aware of the job situation, and they know that it's not only a question of skill to get there. I mean, as I mentioned before, it's like 50% skill and 50% networking and being at the right place at the right time and not having a two-body problem, and it's that long chain of things that have to fit to get these positions. So I think as long as you stay in science, they're happy. I think they would be more disappointed if you leave it, maybe.
I just want to let everybody know that AAAS Committee on Career has a lot of resources for alternative career. If you go to AAAS.org and click on career, they have a list of people who left academia and they who are willing to be contacted for mentor purposes and stuff, and they have their email or telephone numbers listed there. And also the committee on such as women have a blog that interview people who either are in academia or have left academia to ask them about their experience. Lots of similar questions like this, and there are a lot of great resources there too. And there are 2 social networks you can join. One is Good Jobs for Astronomers on Facebook that includes lots of people who were former astronomers now in industry and other businesses. And there is also a more formal group on LinkedIn, which is called Astronomers Beyond Academia, which has thousands of members, and if you just go there, look at their profiles, that'll make you feel more secure and happy instantly, because those people obviously are making more money and live a happy and fulfilling life as well. So go and check those out. Thank you.
I'll also just add in terms of willingness to be contacted, definitely feel free to drop me an email if you have questions about things. If I don't answer your email right away, send me another email and I'll get to it eventually. But I'm happy to talk more.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking all of our panelists for their I am sure that any and all of these people would love to talk more